National Center for Biological Sciences, and Atria University. Understanding how biological and environmental factors interactively shape the global distribution of plant and animal genetic diversity is fundamental to biodiversity conservation. Species interactions, genetic legacy, and biogeography are related to the evolution, distribution, and heredity of species. Today, we will delve into various pivotal aspects of biodiversity, including geographic distribution, the profound impacts of climate change, innovative uses of DNA or eDNA, and the interconnections with agriculture. Let us begin with the auspicious lighting of the lamp, symbolizing triumph of knowledge and light, with Ms. Vibhavari, who will render the invocation for lighting the lamp. And I also request the Vice Chancellor of Atria University, Dr. Rajeevan Nair, Member Advisory Board, Dr. Umesh Varshney, and our speakers for today who are present right now, Professor Raman Sukumar, Professor Saskia, and Professor Praful Chandra to light the lamp.
Shubham karutvam kalyanam arogyam dhana sampadaha. Shubham karutvam kalyanam arogyam dhana sampadaha. Shatru buddhi vinashaya deepa jyotir namostute. Deepa jyoti namostute. Deepajyotir parabrahma, Deepajyotir janardana, Deepo haratu me papam, Pratadipa namostute.
Now to like to introduce Dr. Umesh Varshney. Professor Umesh Varshney is an eminent Indian molecular biologist and former head of a laboratory at the Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore. Currently Honorary Professor, Department of Microbiology and Cell Biology, his groundbreaking studies on protein synthesis and DNA repair in Escherichia coli and Mycobacterium tuberculosis have earned him numerous accolades. A J.C. Bose National Fellow and recognized by the Indian Academy of Sciences and the National Academy of Sciences, Professor Varshney's illustrious career began after completing his doctoral studies in Canada and postdoctoral research in MIT. Since 1991, he has significantly contributed to our understanding of mycobacterial biology, uncovering critical interactions within ribosomes and exploring DNA repair pathways. His work has led to potential drug targets and attenuated strains. Recipient of the National Bioscience Award, the Shanti Swarup Bhatnagar Prize, and the G.N. Ramachandran Gold Medal, Professor Varshney's influence extends beyond research. He has mentored scholars, organized international workshops, and delivered keynote addresses at scientific conferences. Professor Varshney's legacy in molecular biology continues to inspire and shape the future of scientific discovery. I request Professor Umesh Varshney to deliver the inaugural address.
I wasn't really supposed to be here, but I'm sure you will agree that the rains last night and last couple of days have really changed the atmosphere, and there's a lot of relief now. Why am I saying all of this? I think everyone has now realized that the climate change and the influence on the biodiversity and the related areas are going to be really something which are going to be top on our list of studies. Without these studies, it's going to be very difficult to deal with the changes that are happening around us. And I must congratulate Atria University that they already have the climate change, biodiversity related areas as their focus area of research. And so I think that's something, very, commendable that they have done it well ahead of time. I'm part of the advisory board, and that's the reason I stand here. But one of the things, that Praful talked in the last meeting was related to this area. And our former director, Anurag Kumar, also sort of, motivated this idea of holding certain lectures in this broad area of biodiversity and, related climate change related things. And so that was the beginning of having this symposium. I only needed to motivate Praful to some extent, but then I think the management has really turned it into this fantastic event. So really, I want to congratulate the management of Atria University to be able to put together this program in a way that we will see here today. The other thing I want to say is really that today also happens to be the National Technology Day. And National Technology Day is not just about telling about nuclear capabilities that India has. It is also to celebrate science. It is also to recognize people who have worked in the area of science. And also it is really an occasion where we can build on the relationships among the scientists, academic areas, and talk about different collaborations. So I think it happens to be something, I don't know whether it was planned that way, but it happens to be that we are meeting here on 11th of May, that is the National Technology Day. So I won't take much time, and I will say that I want to really thank all the speakers with a very short notice, in fact. They agreed to participate in this symposium. So thanks a lot to all of these speakers. And we wanted to invite a few more people, but as you know that many of the people who work in these areas have a lot of field studies. And so many of them are out on the field studies, and often the connectivity would be poor, so we can't even have them online. So, but I'm sure this is just the beginning. There will be more occasions that we can invite them to come and speak here and sort of enrich this university with their knowledge so that I think this field can move forward. With those words, I'd like to thank everyone, the management of Atria University and the people who have really put together this show. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. I would like to introduce our Vice Chancellor now, Professor Rajeevan Nair. Numerous accolades and accomplishments line the path that Dr. Rajeevan has traversed. The most recent is the Sir Gilbert Walker Gold Medal conferred on 21st November 2023 for a lifetime achievement in atmospheric science. Dr. Rajeevan is the 9th illustrious recipient of this award, instituted about 20 years ago. In the 38 years immersed in weather and climate science, Dr. Rajeevan has worked for the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, Mumbai, the India Met Department, the Indian Institute of Tropical Meteorology, the Department of Space, and the Ministry of Earth Sciences. During his tenure as Secretary to the Indian Ministry of Earth Sciences, he made pioneering contributions to improve weather and climate services in India launching the ambitious 4,200 crore rupees worth Deep Ocean Mission, and developing India's blue economy and Arctic policies. With 14,800 citations and more than 160 research papers, our Vice Chancellor is an inspiration to all. I request the Vice Chancellor to deliver the keynote address.
Yeah, good morning to all of you. I'm extremely happy to be here as part of this important meeting being organized by Atria University. And as Professor Varshney was saying, that it's a good gesture that we want to introduce this kind of topical symposiums, maybe once three to four in a year. And so I should, before I talk about my topic on biodiversity and climate change, I would like to profusely thank Professor Umesh Varshney for helping us to organize this important event, and Dr. Praful for initiating this, and Dr. Sundaraju for supporting us. And I like to separately thank all the speakers who are very distinguished in their own field, the experts, subject experts from IAC as well as NCBS. I know a couple of them very well. Professor Sukumar is my good friend. He's a climate change expert. He is a member of IPCC Bureau and Vice Chair of Working Group 2. I know Karthik Shankar. He is also known to me very well. So we have very distinguished people. So thank you very much for all the speakers to come and attend this, and also all the participants for coming here. So I'm not a life science expert. By training, I'm a physicist. I did my PhD in physics. So, but I work on climate change. So I will briefly speak about, but I'm not an authority in this subject, biodiversity and climate change, but it is important to know that why we are to read about climate change and for biodiversity. And I will tell you, these biodiversity and climate change are not separate entities, both are interlinked. So can you go to the next one? Yeah. So biodiversity is not, you know very well what you mean by biodiversity. And what we see, biodiversity we see today is almost the result of 4.5 billion years of evolution. Now, our life in the Earth has started over 5 billion years ago. And so you know that biodiversity forms the web of life that we depend on so many things: food, water, medicine, stable climate, economic growth. Over half of global GDP is dependent on our nature. More than 1 billion people rely on forests and for their livelihoods. Next one. So, but climate change, as Professor Umesh was saying, that is playing an increasingly important role in the decline of biodiversity. It has been well documented. Climate change has altered marine, terrestrial, and freshwater ecosystems around the world. It has caused loss of local species, increased diseases, and driven mass mortality of plants and animals, resulting in the first climate-driven extinctions. Overall, climate change affects the health of ecosystems, influencing shifts in the distribution of plants, viruses, animals, and even human settlements. This can create increased opportunity for animals to spread and for viruses to spill over to humans. For example, the Kerala Nipah virus, I was told that it's because of a change in the climate system. So there's an increase in this kind of diseases from bats. So why biodiversity is important to climate change? So we were telling the last slide I told about how climate change is impacting biodiversity. But biodiversity also is important of climate change. As all of us know that climate change is caused by increase in greenhouse gases that's caused by human activities. So there's a lot of hue and cry now among all the nations that how we can reduce the carbon footprint, how much you can reduce the carbon emissions. So we also, India as a country in the UN framework, we have made a settlement, we made an undertaking saying that by 2070, we'll be carbon neutral. We'll have a net zero emission of carbon. So that means sources and sinks should be same, equal amount. So question is how we do it. There are a lot of ways of doing it by reducing the carbon. Of course, we can move to renewable energy. That's an important area where we need to concentrate. And also there should be, but that may not be sufficient. That's what estimations suggesting. So what we need to do is kind of a more innovative ideas to how to reduce the carbon from the atmosphere. As we know that forests and biodiversity plays an important role in absorbing the carbon dioxide emitted by human activities. About 50% of the carbon dioxide emitted by us is absorbed by oceans. And forests play an equally important role in absorbing the carbon dioxide. So the biodiversity and ocean play a very, very important role. So nature play an important role of absorbing this carbon dioxide and controlling the so-called the change of climate. So it's a kind of a natural solution. So we need not invest in anything. We have, by nature, we have all these things. We should somehow make use of it. So that's why the famous statement made by Elizabeth Mema. What is the next one? She told climate change is a primary driver of biodiversity loss. And climate change depends on biodiversity as part of the natural solution. So clearly the two are linked and cannot be separated. So these two are very much linked. So when we address about biodiversity, we should address climate change. When we address climate change, we should address the biodiversity. They both are linked. I'll make two more slides. One is on marine biodiversity, which I have a little more experience as a secretary to the Ministry of Earth Sciences. So we do a lot of work on marine biodiversity because ocean is a part of Ministry of Earth Sciences. So marine diversity also is a very important area for the role of oceans and seas, and the three pillars of sustainable development: economic, social, and environmentally supported by oceans. The ocean is one of the main repositories of the world biodiversity. It is much more than the biodiversity we see over the land. So ocean biodiversity is much more. It constitutes about 90% of the habitable space on the planet and contains about 25 lakh known species. And still we say that 2/3 of the world's marine species are still not identified. A very important sentence is almost 90% of oceans are unexplored. We don't know. We know only 10% of the oceans. So one of the objectives of the Deep Ocean Mission, which we launched a few years back, is to explore deep oceans, both for biodiversity, and also for ocean resources, both living as well as non-living. So life in the deep ocean. So this is a very interesting topic. Probably some of you may be knowing it. The history says that, and also the Hindu mythology says that life started from the oceans. Old Dashavadara, they started from fish. Elections are over, so I'm not propagating any messages from some political party. But that's a mythology we have, and also the science says life has started from the oceans. It started from this, next one please. Yeah. It started from, people say that life has started from these hydrothermal vents in the deep oceans. Hydrothermal vents are nothing but small volcanoes in the ocean ridges, which have a lot of hydrothermal sulfides. So we do in the Ministry of Sciences, we have a program to explore these hydrothermal sulfides, because the hydrothermal sulfide, if we process, we can take a lot of metals, very precious metal, copper, nickel, cobalt. So it's a kind of source of metals from the deep ocean. So the question is, it's a very hot area. It's about the temperature over that area will be around 400 degrees Celsius. So you cannot physically go there and do it. So we use remotely operated vehicles to go there, take photographs, and take some measurements, etc. The question is, the high microorganisms that live near such plumes led some scientists to search them as the birthplace of Earth's first life forms about 5 billion years ago. As you all of you know, for life we need solar radiation. Sun is most important, and there no sunlight. So question is, how then life is sustaining there? So these are some basic questions which people are addressing it. So I thought I will bring to it. So of course it's of interest to all of you. So however, the origin of life is a widely debated topic, and there are many conflicting viewpoints. So this is my last slide. So of course we know that there is a lot of biodiversity in the ocean. So then people started exploring it, what we do it from over the land, and also we try to exploit it and damage it. So there is a new convention came from UN recently, last year, is the marine biological diversity of areas beyond natural jurisdiction. What do you mean is, each country has kind of a marine jurisdiction. We can go up to 200 nautical mile from the coast, and you can do whatever you want. That area belongs to you. But beyond that, it's international waters. We need to follow some kind of rules, international rules, how to explore, how to exploit, etc. So a new rule has come last year, and I thought Karthik will be here, because Karthik Shankar was involved in this kind of deliberation, which is to be done in New York every year by UN. There's a UN body, so Ministry of Science is to sponsor these visits. So I remember Karthik was going there. So it is good that we have brought a new guidelines on 19 June 2023, an agreement between all the countries that we will not spoil the marine biodiversity, but we will very carefully explore the marine diversity. So with this kind of initial introduction, I am very sure that there are a lot of good interesting lectures are coming up. So I am very sure that you will enjoy. Please ask questions to them. Please you make use of this opportunity to talk to them, interact with them, and I wish you all the best. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. We will now begin with the speaker series. Before I introduce the first speaker, we will also have time scheduled for audience question and answers after the talk is delivered. So our first speaker today is Professor Raman Sukumar. He is internationally known for his pioneering research on the ecology, behavior, and conservation of Asian elephants. His work has covered topics as varied as elephant-human interactions, reproductive biology, molecular genetics, evolutionary history, population dynamics, landscape ecology, movement ecology, and the cultural history of elephants. His research interests also extend to tropical forest ecology and climate change. Professor Sukumar has also contributed extensively to Indian government policy on wildlife conservation. He was one of the architects of India's flagship conservation initiatives, Project Elephant, which was launched in 1992. He was the chair of the IUCN Asian Elephant Specialist Group during 1997 to 2004. The author of 4 books on the elephant and over 200 scientific papers, Professor Sukumar is the recipient of several national and international awards, the most notable being the International Cosmos Prize from Japan in 2006. Professor Sukumar is a fellow of the 3 major science academies in India and the World Academy of Sciences. He has also contributed for 3 decades to the work of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, that shared the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007 and the Gulbenkian Prize for Humanity in 2022. Professor Sukumar will be speaking on Thinking Long-Term in Ecology, the Mudumalai Forest Dynamics Plots. I welcome you, sir.
It's a pleasure to be here, to see many friends and colleagues, Dr. Rajeevan, whom I've known for many years, many of my colleagues from my institute, and other friends and so on. When I usually speak, I think most people will expect me to speak on the elephant, but I made an exception this time. I said I'll not talk about elephants, I want to talk about climate change. I promise you I'll bring in the elephant only very, very briefly into this talk. And the title of my talk is Thinking Long-Term in Ecology. You know, the typical funding for a research project in the universities for students, or a duration of a student PhD thesis is 3 or 4 years. On the other hand, climate scientists will tell you that when you talk about climate of an area, you need to have data for 30 years. If you have data for a few years, you can't say the climate in Bangalore is, today is humid, or it is the weather. It's not really the climate. In the context of climate change that Dr. Rajeevan referred to, long-term observations are extremely important to understand the interaction between climate change and biodiversity, in this case forest, carbon sequestration, a whole range of other kinds of issues that come up when we talk about climate change that we are all experiencing right now. Okay, don't have any doubts about it. climate change is happening, it's for real, and we need to decide how to adapt to ongoing climate change as well as to contribute to mitigating climate change. I mean, this talk, a lot of people have contributed to it, so I've just given some of the names of the people. Now, when we start a research project, I mean, the scientific methodology typically tells you that, you should set up a very neat question right up in the beginning. You should have a set of questions. You should set up a hypothesis. Okay, and then you should go out to the field and then you should do experiments or observations or whatever to try and see whether your hypothesis is corroborated by the data and your statistical analysis or whatever. But on the other hand, I also think that there is a merit to something simply called monitoring. It's a very vague term. I'm just going out and I'm doing monitoring. I'm just monitoring nature or whatever else, just gathering data. There is also a certain merit to it. I'm not saying that all science should be done that way. I certainly don't encourage all students to think only that way, but there is a certain merit to it. And I'll just show what the merit is. The whole climate change field itself, it really owes a huge debt of gratitude to a person called Charles Keeling. Charles Keeling in the US, he began simply collecting carbon dioxide samples. In the atmosphere, we know carbon dioxide as, 100 years ago, let's say it was about, or industrial, during the just beginning of the industrial age, it was something like 280 parts per million. It's become more than 400 or 420 today. In 1958, Charles Keeling said, let me just begin to monitor the CO2 levels in the atmosphere. And Mauna Loa is in the island of Hawaii, and he just began collecting CO2 samples. And a few years later, apparently the National Science Foundation of the US stopped funding for his research. It said that all that you're doing is some routine measurement of CO2. What's the big deal? What's the science in it? Just like we're monitoring levels of pollution in the air today or whatever, what's the big merit in it? Or measuring temperatures or rainfall. We recognize the importance of, having good records on rainfall and temperature today. But what's the big science in it? This was called as routine research. There's no merit to it. But today, we know that the simple monitoring is the basis for the whole, all that we know today about the rate of rise of CO2 in the atmosphere. It's really kind of crucial to the whole thing. Of course, his work was recognized later with prizes and so on and so forth, but he simply began this as a monitoring project. Now, I go back to the mid-80s or so, where I was working in the tropical forests of the Western Ghats, and I just completed a doctorate on the elephant, on Asian elephant ecology, on elephant-human interactions, what we call conflict today, and and so on. And I wanted to do long-term research because I realized that the elephant was a long-lived creature. You can't understand the life of the elephant by studying it for 3 years or 4 years. It's a long-lived creature. I also come from a plant sciences background. I'm not a zoologist, I'm a botanist. And therefore, I know that trees also live for a very long time. It can live 100 years, can live 5,000 years if you take the bristlecone pine in California or wherever. Trees can live for a very long time. But to me, what was of interest at that time was the elephant. I always look at science through the eyes, or I would say the long nose of an elephant. And wherever I get some good smell in terms of new areas of research, I go into it. Elephant damage to trees. I noticed that elephants were damaging trees. Okay. And in Africa, there was a big debate because elephants were converting the forest into grassland. And there was a big debate whether you should go and kill the elephants because there are too many elephants in an area. They are converting the forest into grassland, which is not desirable and so on. I noticed that in our forest also, the elephants were going and they were pushing over certain trees, acacias and tectona, which is teak, and so on and so forth. And I wanted to know whether what impact this made on our forest. Would our forest be converted to grassland, like what happened in Africa? Okay. So I thought that we should start setting up permanent research plots. The only way you can monitor is to go to a certain area. Very often people go and measure biodiversity. When you measure biodiversity, you take a sample, you take a 1 hectare plot, or you do a transect, or do something, you count the birds, the species, or you do inventory of all the trees and the shrubs or whatever that you want, you come up with some measure of diversity. But then, what are the changes that are taking place? What are the changes? That change is very important for us to measure. And there are very few research projects that are actually measured because long-term funding is usually not assured. And fortunately, the Ministry of Environment had set up the Center for Excellence in the form of CES at IISc. And we had helped design the Nilgiri Biosphere Reserve. And I decided that I'm going to start long-term research in the Nilgiri Biosphere Reserve. So my research here began exactly 3 decades ago with the goal of long-term monitoring initially. Okay, I had some questions, obviously I had some questions. What was the impact elephant was making? I knew that fire was an issue. What is the impact that fires were making to the forest? How do you manage these forests for timber operations, which of course is not relevant anymore and so on. And a very simple set of questions I had. But a more hypothesis-driven research agenda came up only later. As the work progressed, then, very often we didn't even know what questions to ask 30 years or 35 years ago. Many often the questions came much later. In fact, I should tell you that I should have set up a bet, a formal bet with a very, very famous biologist, I won't name the biologist, who had come to Mudumalai and looked at this forest and told me, Sukumar, this forest is going to disappear in 25 years. Because you have a lot of trees, but you have very few plants in the understory. You have a lot of grasses. So once these trees die, then they will go and the forest will disappear. I did some very quick thinking. He's much older to me, much more senior, much better known. I was a very, very young, just a young faculty who had just joined ISC. I said, no, why is it that just because the two of us here are here and looking at the forest, we think the forest will disappear? Forest has been there for hundreds of years, right? Mudumalai or Bandipur or Nagarhole has been there for hundreds of years. We've always been like this. Why should it disappear? I told him, no, I don't think that the forest will disappear. You come back 25 years from now, the forest will still be there. And let's see what happened. So then, over a period of time, this research became more and more relevant to the modern day context of climate change. I had not even set it up to think about climate change impacts on forests when I started this research. Because let's go and put up permanent forest plots. And let us see what happens over time. Let's see what the elephants are doing. Let's see what fire is doing. And then it started. So where are we in South India? The Western Ghats, you all know. Mountain chain running. You have a strong rainfall gradient from west to east. The southwest monsoon brings copious rainfall to the western part of the Ghats, go over the mountains, and then, in the rain shadow region, the rainfall declines. And Mudumalai is a sanctuary, bounded by Wayanad, Bandipur, and so on, which you all know. Here you have a rainfall and a vegetation gradient. So in Mudumalai, if you take, is there a pointer that I can have? Possibly, yeah. Thank you. This one, okay, thank you. So if you start from the western part here, you will find that the rainfall is about 1800 millimeters per year. And if you go to the eastern part, it's about 700 millimeters per year. And just about 60 kilometers. So a very, very sharp rainfall gradient. And therefore, the vegetation types are also very different. The canopy structure is very different. And at the western end, it looks very wet. It's very wet. And it's a tropical semi-evergreen forest or, with 1800 millimeters of rainfall. It almost looks like a rainforest. I've just come back from Borneo. It's not as good as the forest of Borneo, but still it looks, the understory pretty much looks like this. And then as you go along the rainfall gradient further east, you come across slightly drier. It's still very wet here, 1500 millimeters of rainfall. You come to this, it's about 1000 millimeters of rainfall. This was the forest that my friend biologist was looking at and said that the forest will disappear. And then you come to the eastern part. And then it looks like the African savanna. You go to East Africa or Tanzania or South Africa, Kruger National Park, you will come across a forest that looks like this. All this within 60 kilometers. That contributes to the fantastic diversity, the topographic complexity and the sharp rainfall gradient in the Western Ghats, driven by the southwest monsoon. To some extent, you get the northeast monsoon coming during the winter months. Only on the eastern side, it contributes to the fantastic diversity that we call the Western Ghats today. So I just began setting up a very large forest plot of 50 hectares. Now 50 hectare plot nobody had attempted in India. They had attempted only a 1 hectare plot. In fact, in the world, there were only 2 such plots. One in Panama, set up by the Smithsonian, and the second in Malaysia, set up by Harvard and the Forest Research Institute of Malaysia. So very, very large plot of 50 hectares. because you need to have large sample size to understand what's happening. Otherwise, the sample size for many species is very, very small. So when we set up the plot, we had 26,000 trees and 72 species. And then I realized that you had a rainfall gradient. So you can't understand the ecosystem by just having one plot in the central part of Mudumalai. You need to cover this entire gradient. 50-hectare plots across the whole of Mudumalai would have been back-breaking work. I don't think we had the funding or the, this thing for any other resources for it. So we set up 19 1-hectare plots with 20,000 plants and 198 species. Okay, so this is a thing where we started with about 50,000 trees being monitored. And this is something that's continued for more than 3 decades today. And it really provides a lot of very, very deep insights into forest ecology, the role of climate change, which I'll come to. So this is the flagship plot, the big 50-hectare plot, the very large plot. And then the 1-hectare plots that are set up along the gradient. The dry forest here, the wet forest here, you have this given gradient here. So this is a look from space, and this is what the 50-hectare plot looks like. And the dynamics of the plot, if you look at, it's actually very interesting. You'll see the forest is fairly dynamic. You look at this shows you the top shows you the rainfall. There's a variation in rainfall. This is the fire frequency, and these are the temperatures. So you see a lot of rainfall variability, many years above normal, some years below normal, and so on. I just run the simulation once again. And this is when the fires occur. So the first 20 years or so, you had fire, you had a big fire, and then you have no fire for many, many years. And there is something happening in the plot. You see that these are all different stems that are kind of undergoing change, are disappearing, or new stems are coming up, and so on. Okay, so there is a certain dynamics. So the first thing I realized was that fires play a very, very important role in the plot. And the fire return intervals are somewhere between once in 19 years here to once in 11 years here, and once in 3 years in the central part. Now, this is very important for us to understand in terms of fire, because you read in the newspapers like Uttarakhand, Nainital, big fires have happened recently, and a lot of concerns. We want to send helicopters and the Air Force and put out the forest fires. The first thing, let me explain the reason why the fires are not most frequent in the driest area or in the wettest area. They are most frequent in the middle rainfall, in the medium rainfall area. The wettest area has, what do fires need? Fires need fuel. And the fuel has to be flammable. And the fuel is, in this case, the biomass, the litter, the grass, and it has to be dry enough. You have a lot of fuel here, but it is very wet, too wet to burn. You have very little fuel here in the eastern part because the rainfall is low, productivity is very low, but it's too little fuel to burn. Very dry, but too. Therefore, you get the optimal conditions for fire in the mid-rainfall regime, about 1,000 millimeters to 1,200, 1,300 millimeters. Now, what indigenous people, I'm just mentioning this because traditional knowledge systems are becoming very important in today's context of climate change also. We tend to be very dismissive of our tribal people, indigenous people who constitute 10% of our population, who have been here for generations. They are the first out of Africa migrants who came to the subcontinent and settled starting from 65,000 years ago. They have that natural connect to nature and the experience about nature. They had been managing the forests by setting fire very early in the season. Very early in the dry season. Cool. December, January, they'll do these light fires. The fuel will disappear. Not much destruction because the temperature of the fire will be very low. It will not cause any damage. Then came the colonial period when you had the British forestry system between about 1850 and 1950, when the whole mindset was very different. The European colonial foresters wanted to control the natives. They wanted timber production. So they outlawed the setting up of fire. It's a policy that we foolishly continue to till today. So what happens? They go on protecting the forest against fire. Come February, come March, come April, suddenly there is a fire. When the temperatures are blazing. And these fires are very destructive fires, high temperature fires. So we are still not learned. 2 years ago, one of our government agencies had a meeting on forest fires, funded by the World Bank. I was the only one who, I could not go myself, a colleague of mine went and presented a paper, was to why we need to go back to some indigenous fire management practices. Rather than that, Your whole theme was after the fire starts, how you put out the fire. It is not before the fire starts, how do you lower the risk of fire. Okay, so I'm just mentioning these things. I'm not getting into elaborate discussions on all of these things in this forum, but I'm just mentioning this. Now, the forest itself over a period of time, and this is data up to 2015, 16, 20, we are going to do the full census once again now. You see certain species, especially the canopy trees, are pretty steady in number. On the other hand, these are the shrubs. You see some of these shrubs, they're going back and forth. There's one tree, of course, this is called Lagastromia, which is actually going up. This is teak, and there's something called anagesis. These are pretty much steady. And these are shrubby plants. These shrubs are going up and down. So the big canopy trees are having a steady population. The shrubs, the understory trees, are showing a lot of dynamics. Coming back to the elephant, these are two species called Kidia and Helictrus. These are favored by elephants. The elephants feed on these plants. And I am not given the full name of the plant. Helictrus isora and Kidia calcina. Any botanist here? Initially, the population of these two species crashed to about 10%. 90% of the plants disappeared. But then you see, after a long period of time, suddenly Helictrus has exploded in population. And Kidia also has made a comeback, although it has not gone back to the original. So there is a change that is happening, which is not comprehensible if you are looking at a very short time slice. It just doesn't tell you anything about nature and about a forest at all. Now, this is the different sizes of the trees that are there. If you look at the larger sized trees, there are actually a slight increase in the numbers. If you look at the smallest size stems, which is less than 5 centimeters, you see the big flux that's happening. Initially, the number of small plants went down. These are all different census periods. 88, 92, 96, 2000, 2004, and so on and so forth. And then you have this big boom that took place. So the forest is highly dynamic. This is my favorite slide. Just my favorite slide, because in 2009, I had the opportunity to present this before the Minister for Environment at a meeting on national consultation meeting on climate change. Now, what this represents is that the green skyscrapers, the red skyscrapers represent death rate of the death of trees. The green skyscrapers represent the birth of trees, new stems that have come up. Now, I set up the plot in 88 and from 89, 90, 91, 92. So I said if a PhD student had been with me and had worked on the forest dynamics, this student by 92, 93 would have submitted a thesis, would have come to the conclusion that this forest is hopeless. The number of trees dying is much greater than the number of new stems that are coming up. This forest will disappear. Corroborating what my American biologist friend had observed in 1988 when he came to Mudumala, 1986 when he came to Mudumala. But then if the student had joined me in 92 and had worked till about 95, 96, would have said, I don't know, I'm not very sure. Some years the death rate is higher than the birth rate, and some rate the number of stems that are coming up, like green, is slightly higher. I'm not very sure about it. The student had joined me in 97 and had submitted a thesis by 2000, would have said, no, the number of births, the new stems that are coming up are more than the number of trees that have died. Okay, I'm just giving a simplistic picture. Now, if the student had worked with me, I had set up the plot in, let's say, 2004. If we didn't have this whole history at all, the student would have said, wonderful, wonderful forest. It's a fully, the regeneration is so good. The greens are far, far greater than the number of stems that are dying. I said every PhD student's thesis has to be, and all papers published has to be thrown into the dustbin. I actually used these words. The Honorable Minister then said, Sukumar, what do you want? I said, we need to have long-term research sites on ecology in the country. That was my last slide. I'll come to that. Something started and it is taking a certain direction. So you can understand the importance of how dynamic nature is. And don't get upset in the newspapers, there is a drought, some 2 elephant calves have died, some 10 cheetal have died. Today is a very interesting article by my friend Sanjay Gubbi who said, nature needs a good drought for population control of animals. It goes contrary to what sometimes people think. The milk of human compassion, we think that, we need to prevent all animal deaths. It is not only unrealistic, it's totally foolish. You just read today's Deccan Herald. So nature is extremely dynamic. Now you look at recruitment, the plants that have come up in 1995, only a few plants have come up. And in 2006, the number of plants that have come up are many more species have come up. So this is the changing nature of the dynamics of our tropical dry forests like Nagarhole, Bandipur, all these, Bilgiri Rangans, all these places, Mudumalai, that you're all familiar with. Now growth, of course, varies. I'm not getting into technical details. These are the canopy species, and this depends on the rainfall. So we had a big drought between 2000 and 2004. I'm sure Dr. Rajeevan will know this, 3 to 4. That was more extensive drought than any other drought in the last 35, 40 years that I know of. We have had a drought last year. Hopefully La Nina conditions will, make it, maybe monsoon may be normal this year, I don't know. But 2000 to 2004 was the most prolonged drought period, and some surprising insights we got about forest ecology. Okay, so you can see the growth rates are the lowest in all the trees, except one terminalia, which seems to be pretty steady. Okay, don't look at the large sizes. This is the size of the tree. The sample size is very small here. So look at the bulk of this. It seems to be very resilient by and large. Okay, but so there's variation in the growth depending on the rainfall, obviously. But the most surprising result from our plot was this. That is, when you take the large trees and you look at the death rate of these trees, there is a 2-year time lag correlation between decline in rainfall and the death. That is, if you have a drought this year, the trees will die 2 years from now. They can still survive. They can still survive. Unlike temperate forest, like in Europe, or tropical wet forest, like in Borneo and Sarawak and Malaysia and so on, the trees will die within 1 year. Our trees here in the tropical dry forest can survive for up to 2 years. That's a time. That's a certain inbuilt resilience. Is I think a product of natural selection and evolution of life history traits. I will not get into great amount of detail. And the most important thing is that the death rate of the trees, once the trees grow to more than 30 centimeters, the death rate of our trees here is one of the lowest that you have recorded in tropical forests. That is the key to the survival. It's 0.5% per year is the annual death rate of the trees. If you go to a tropical rainforest, Malaysia and so on, Congo and so on, the death rate is 2% per year. So our death rate of the trees is 1/4. That contributes to the survival. That's the reason why the forest has not disappeared. And in spite of the fact that you have very few young stems, because once they grow to a certain size, they live for a very long time. So these are the kinds of traits that we are just disappearing in this. Now a simple quiz. I ask this, and usually people, if you have a severe drought, which kinds of trees would suffer the most? Deep-rooted trees or the shallow-rooted trees? Any answer to this? Shallow-rooted will suffer the most. Okay. It's actually the opposite when you have a prolonged drought. It's the deep-rooted trees that suffer the most. I'll not get into technical details about this, please. So I know it's probably a somewhat general audience. This is a rainfall. This is a below ground discharge. The plants take water from what is called as a vadose zone below the ground. And there are different layers there. Those who know soils and geology and all that will understand this. And these are reservoirs from which they draw the water. And my colleagues in the Indo-French water cell had worked out a model whereby the relationship between the rainfall and the amount of water that is found in the deep reservoirs. Okay, so what happens is, I'll just give the result and then I will explain to you. We did something called sophisticated inverse modeling and so on, which I will not get into details. This is just to show you different species of trees, and this is to show you the rootedness. So this is the most deep-rooted tree, Terminalia. This is the most shallow-rooted tree, Stereosperma, STET. Okay, this is the gradient. Okay, this is the update water depth index from where they are drawing the water. And when you look at the mortality of these trees, the mortality of the trees that are deeper rooted is actually higher than the species that are shallow rooted. Simply because The deep-rooted trees, they go below the ground much more. They suck the water out and they deplete the water. That water takes two years to replenish. So if you have a 4-year drought, after 2 years you don't have enough water to take. That's a trade-off between stomatal closure and so on, elongated. So the deep-rooted trees are dying at a higher rate. And this happened only once in the last 30 years, over a prolonged drought, 4 years drought. And we observed this. 3-year study, 4-year study, all useless. You will never ever get this pattern. You will think that Terminalia tomentosa or granulata, that particular species, TRT, is virtually immortal because it doesn't die at all. Once in 30 years or 40 years, you have this prolonged drought, and then it dies. Okay, so that is very interesting. You heard a lot about Lantana camara, invasive species, right? It's all over the place. In Bangalore, in Bannerghatta, in Mudumalai, Wayanad, everywhere it is there. What happened during the drought period, we found that Lantana camara, which is the red here, suddenly started increasing just as the drought was ending. And that grass, which was there, started declining. So you go to the forest today and if you have observed the forest in 1992, 93 or late 80s, you'll find a lot of grass in Nagarhole and Mudumalai. Today you won't find grass at all. So the Lantana camara 1990, the picture, very little, many places there's no Lantana at all. There are only a few hot spots here and there. That's why we set up the plot here. In 2020, you see the Lantana camara, how much it is increased. You take the grasses, tall grasses, 1990, you see dense grass all over, which is what my friend saw. And then by 2020, the dense grass is all gone. So there's so much of change that is taking place. And there is a climatic link to this. We have a paper in PLOS 1 where we showed the prolonged drought, fire and drought actually caused the Lantana camara to establish. And the atmospheric CO2. Atmospheric CO2 does not, increase in CO2 does not favor the grasses, C4 plants or the tropical grasses. It favors the woody plants like Lantana camara, and that exploded. And now we have newer species coming in, Senna spectabilis. And when I came to join IIC in 1979, this was all in bloom in the month of August. Today it has become a highly invasive plant in Bandipur and Wayanad and Mudumalai, and nothing grows below. I'll come to a few other interesting things. I'll just take another 5 minutes and stop. In spite of all this, by now you can see that the forest has not disappeared. Our Mudumalai 50-hectare plot of the Mudumalai forest has not disappeared. There are changes, but the forest has not disappeared. So in many ways, what I told my American friend biologist in 1986, that this forest will not disappear in 25 years. It has not disappeared in 35 years. If at all, the carbon stock has increased in this forest. This is the 50-hectare plot. You will see that this is contribution from native trees, lantana, grasses, chromalid. These are other species, but nevertheless, if you look at the overall trend, okay. Now you will see here that some years the carbon stock change has been very little. In 1 year, this big drought, the carbon stock changed slightly, but you see it's partly made up because the lantana increased. And then it increased, and now in recent years you see very strong carbon sequestration has happened. Maybe CO2 fertilization, plants are always limited by the amount of CO2. You have a lot of carbonate. Okay, so the good news is that. But if you look at it at the landscape scale, there are more complex patterns. We are always very concerned about the net zero that Dr. Rajeevan mentioned that we'll achieve by 2070. India made a commitment that in the forestry sector, we will sequester additional 2.5 to 3 billion tons of CO2 equivalent by 2030. Big question marks about it. Where the numbers came from, we don't know. And how they made that commitment. Now they are realizing the mistake of making such commitments. I've been telling people, now look at it. Now 2015 to 2019, there's been very strong carbon sequestration. But look at this particular period where carbon sequestration across the entire landscape was very weak. So this goes through cyclical patterns of carbon sequestration. So now we got into La Nina was over. Now El Nino has come last year. So the carbon stock, increase will just not be there. So we have to be very careful, take a long-term picture. But overall, it still shows that the overall Mudumalai, the biomass has been increasing, carbon stock at the scale of the landscape. This is only one site. Okay. The next is the general change that has taken place. This is rainfall, and this is the gain or loss of biodiversity, of plant diversity, woody plant diversity. You will see that in the medium rainfall areas, the diversity has increased, but in both at the lower end and the higher end, the diversity has decreased. Now, why this is happening, we don't know. Dr. Rajeevan, I would like to speak to you at some stage. I feel in the wetter areas, this 30, 40 year, Dr. Rajendran and others model that the rainfall in the southwestern Ghats has been coming down. Whether that could have been responsible for this decline of diversity I'm not very sure, but this requires. I've been fortunate that, so this is the kind of patterns that we find in the long term, which we need to take care of. I've been very fortunate, pretty much the same team for 35 years, Dr. Suresh, Baranaya, some of our Krishna, our field trackers, our tribal trackers, they have been working with us for 35 years. It's a luxury to have, they're all on soft money, they're still working with us, and therefore we are able to do this enumeration. And I'm just going to the field on Monday, and we are going to start the next full round of enumeration. We also contributed, to fundamental understanding of science, of ecology. 30 years ago, I had expressed the opinion when, in ecology, there's a concept of the niche. And there is a concept of the neutral dynamics, which a person called Steve Hubble made very, very famous. I very briefly expressed my opinion that I speculated that stochastic dynamics, because of because environment changes, is fluctuating so much. I'm talking about 30, 35, 40 years ago. Could actually be more important than niche or neutral dynamics. And lo and behold, in 2014, we put together from 12 different forests across the world, and we actually showed that it is actually environmental stochasticity that is actually very important in driving the dynamics of this forest. And more recently, when there are certain pet theories in ecology, as in any other subject, nearest neighborhood effects and so on and so forth, Jansen-Connell effect and all that. And I said, no, these are not important in our open forest. And my student, Sandeep, we managed to actually show that in tropical dry forest, your nearest neighbor is not very, very important. It's not very important whether you have, another neighbor who's the same species as you, as a different species as you. What's really important are climate and fire, which are very stochastic in nature. So we have contributed both to applied, in terms of forest ecology, as well as in terms of our fundamental understanding of what drives forest dynamics. Now, when I said that we need to have long-term ecological sites in the country, the government said yes. We started a process of discussion, national discussion, and by 2015, we produced a science plan, which many of my colleagues at IIC, including Karthik and others, participated in, and we produced this. This was launched at the Paris Climate Summit in 2015 by the minister. And, India has different biogeographic zones. So what I study in Mudumalai cannot be true in the Himalaya, Western Himalaya, Eastern Himalaya, the mangroves of Sundarbans or whatever. So we need to have representative long-term ecological research sites. So this was conceived like that. A multidisciplinary, multi-institutional program of monitoring ecological processes, and sites selected on the basis of biogeographic representativeness, and research and monitoring at a hierarchy of scales from the landscape down to the local scale, and many, many different species, and 30 plus institutions, a consortium we have put together for this work. 6 sites have been selected in the first round. This has not been selected. Sundarban, Western Himalaya, Uttarakhand, Eagle Nest in Arunachal, Gujarat for a arid zone, teak sal transition zone in Madhya Pradesh, Western Ghats, the Nilgiri Biosphere Reserve, and Andaman Nicobars. These were selected in 2020. The program started. Each of these themes has a theme leader: forest dynamics, grassland and soil, birds, herpetofauna, freshwater, arthropods, insects and others, coastal marine and animal movement. Unfortunately, the COVID hit. We still kept going, but the funding dried up. After a couple of years, the funding completely dried up, and we have a lot of challenges. I'll just stop here to show you. Incubation time was 2009, science plan, financial approval, 21st March. 24th March, the COVID lockdown came, and but we still began functioning. We still selected all the sites. Permissions from Forest Department took 1 week to 1 year, and after the first tranche of money, no funds were released for 2 years. Just 1 month ago, we have got a small amount of money. I'm not sure if the program will, at what stage it will continue and all that. But we need to think long-term in ecology. And just like particle physicists and think of these huge experiments, we need to, have natural laboratories. The idea was that this will provide field stations for young scientists to come and sit and work at different elevations. Like, for instance, in Uttarakhand, the sites start from Corbett at the foothills, going right up to Kedarnath Wildlife Sanctuary at 3,000 meters. So in Western Ghats, it starts from the Kerala Western slopes, high rainfall area to the low rainfall area of the eastern part of Mudumalai. Different gradients we have looked at. This needs a lot of support, and whether government is going to give us or that we need to go to other sources, I'm not very sure. But I'll stop here, and thank you very much.
If the audience has any questions.
So, great talk, Sukumar. So the shallow-rooted plants or trees, they sustain dryness better because of the condensate water can be better utilized by them?
See, when you have a deficit rainfall, there's still water in the upper layers of the soil. And then they are stomatal. There's a trade-off between the amount of water vapor that is released by stomatal closure. So what they do is they let out water more easily than the deep-rooted trees. But they also photosynthesize. They're able to photosynthesize and they're able to survive. These deep-rooted fellows, what happens? Their roots are all going right down into the lowest vadose layer. And after 2 years, the water dries up. They don't have enough water. So they can't take in enough water to do photosynthesis.
But what about the condensate water? In the mornings when the temperature is low, some condensate will be
there.
there.
I mean, the plants survive. It's not that all the trees die. But what I'm saying is it's a relative, it's a trade-off. So it's just that the death rate goes up in the deeper rooted trees.
So the other question I have is regarding the forest fire. So you mentioned that artificial or creating fire before a lot of dry period is a good idea. Rather than fire, can we not deplete the plants which are giving a lot of fumable material?
Right. Yeah. Now,
in both the cases, we are getting rid of them by fire as well as with this one.
Right. Yeah. See, most of the plants that you find in these areas are immortal. They're not dead. There's no plant that is dead. They're alive below the ground. So all that you're doing is you are clearing the surface through low temperature fire, which does not necessarily kill even the shoots in many cases. So after the rains come, they're able to regenerate. And some of our indigenous native people have been able to work this out over several generations of being in this area. And today, the reason I mentioned this is that everywhere you had the big fires in Australia. You've had big fires in California. You had big fires in the north of the Arctic Circle a few years ago, for the first time ever recorded in recent times. Fires have been a part of the natural systems and human control of fire ever since the evolution, not only Homo sapiens, but even from Homo erectus times. And I think there is evidence that genus Homo has controlled fire from about 650,000 years ago at least. And many of our natural landscapes are adapted to fires. Many of the seeds of the plants they germinate when you have fire. So it's a complex kind of a system. We still have a lot to learn from them. So when the big Australian fires happened, they said, Australian Aborigines reached Australia 55,000 years ago. And they were managing the landscape and, to prevent the risk of high conflagration or high temperature fire. So it's a trade-off. But I think, if you do it carefully, you can still maintain high biodiversity. Areas that are burnt also have their unique biodiversity because you have grasslands, or more grassy undergrowth, which helps sustain the herbivores and a whole lot of other species. And the fire regimes will be different in different areas. I think we need to protect the rainforest strictly from fire. But the dry forest, I think we need to set fire carefully. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that enlightening talk, Professor Sukumar. You talked about the long-term dynamics of a forest, right? And a little bit also about recognizing our ignorance when it comes to how nature works over long time periods. And now there is a lot of recognition of climate change and a desire to act. My question to you, how do we act in the face of the ignorance that we are seeing?
That's a really good question. I don't know. Because actions are taken by governments and I can't really speak for them. I think it's very important, society as a whole, governments to really recognize, I know you had the COVID pandemic and that's emerging zoonotic disease is an important area. You put your money into it and so on and so forth. And I think on climate change, we really need to double up. It's not just monitoring the climate. That's very important. There's one aspect about it. But the climate interaction with the biodiversity, with the natural ecosystems that I think Dr. Rajeevan very well referred to very briefly in his talk, the interaction between biodiversity and climate change and nature-based solutions and so on, that now Western countries are now telling us, now nature-based solutions are the way to go. After all the carbon dioxide that they have emitted now, you countries, but there is I don't know whether I missed one important slide, just 1 minute. I think one slide did not come through. I'll just put that. I think I forgot to put it in. Okay, I spoke about the carbon sequestration in Mudumalai and even Indian forest. I had a comparative slide which I have given to the ministry for the NatCom, what they call the NatCom, where they report to the UNFCCC. The Amazonian forest. The Amazonian forest. Do you know the size of the Amazonian forest? The extent of the Amazonian forest, it is 5 times the size of India. That's the extent of the forest. Our forests are very piddly, it's right, nothing at all, it's very, very little. The forests of the Amazon are losing their ability as a sink of carbon. Again, Dr. Rajeevan referred that 50% of all the carbon sequestration on the land goes into the ocean and remaining into the land, right? So, or if you take the total 100 units of CO2 we put out into the atmosphere, only 50 units are there in the atmosphere. 25 goes into the ocean, 25 goes into the plants. And there is a lot of hope that mitigation, we can mitigate for all the greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuel burning by planting trees and this and that and so on and so forth, conserving our forest. But there is emerging evidence today that the Amazonian forests have it's almost come to zero today. Almost come to zero, which is very, very alarming. The data are still out there. There are papers published in Nature Climate Change. The jungles of the Congo has followed this with a 10-year time lag. And that's also going down, the carbon sequestration facility, the ability of capacity to go down. So there is a lot of uncertainty about the ability of our land, of our vegetation to be able to sink carbon. There are limits to it. So these are all questions out there. Therefore, we need to redouble our research efforts. We need to put in, because we have to be on firm ground. When we go up and say, we are conserving forests, we are sequestering so much of carbon, where are the data? We need to have hard scientific data, otherwise people will not take us seriously.
Do we have any more questions?
A lot of questions.
Sir, one question here. I am Ram.
Yeah.
Climate change is also depends on the war. I mean, we are all on Earth. We are all connected with water, oceans, and also atmosphere, sky, everything, Earth, through Earth. That is we call as Panchabhuta.
Right.
We are all connected. When war creates the pollution, that also transforms to the entire world in some way. That may change the climate, that impacts the climate change.
It will. I have something called aerosols. I'll just give a very, very brief answer. It's too complex a topic again. Aerosols make an impact at the regional scales for short term. In the short term, they are not long-term climate forces. They're called short term because you have a very polluted Delhi. The temperatures in Delhi will be a little bit lower than what it will be otherwise. But of course, it causes a lot of health issues and health problems. I leave it at that, but it's a very complex topic. A lot of people are addressing it. Yeah, somebody else, please. Yeah. A lot of questions coming from that side.
I'm not an ecologist. I don't have that experience. But we are talking about forest conservation and all those things. But what about the urbanization? Because that is exceeding the speed at what was there 10 years back, if you see Bangalore only. So that is also affecting the climate change a lot, right? Even if we conserve the forest, what about the urbanization? We are not able to control that.
Yeah, it's a different topic, sorry. I won't get into urbanization. IPCC is commissioning a special report on climate change and cities, which is just about beginning. You'll hear more about it. Urbanization is a different topic altogether. Sorry for that. But we can use plants intelligently as for mitigation. In fact, Europe is trying to do that. So for cooling the cities, try to grow trees and try to keep the temperatures down and so on and so forth. It has a role. I'll just leave it at that. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, please.
So very interesting talk. As you said about the drought, the death because of the drought, all the animals, like the cheetahs died, and that news you are telling. I have one doubt, like, okay, the drought is a part of nature, and some population management happens. But the species what they are talking about, like cheetah or the elephants or like
cheetah, spotted deer.
Mostly cheetah. So those are the animals which are already endangered by humans.
No. See, so I'll put it like this.
Yeah.
No. Cheetah is not endangered at all in the country. There are millions and millions of cheetah. By cheetah, I mean spotted deer. Okay. Not the cheetah. Cheetah has been introduced into the country.
I mean,
elephants are not really. See, this depends on the population. If you take South India, we have 15,000 elephants, and the elephant population has doubled in the last 40 years. So elephants are not endangered from that point of view. There has to be a natural regulation. Supposing you're talking about elephant in Vietnam. I worked in Vietnam 20 years ago. There's a park where you had only 15 elephants left. That park, you don't want any elephants to die. So that the management should be very different. Okay. So I'll just put it in.
One small thing. You are talking about carbon sequestration and the growing more forest and thing. But there is what I have read is that even if you grow more plants now, the sequestration is mostly happening more in the old trees, like old forest, than the new whatever we are planting. So that matters the most.
Both. It's a complex topic. Sorry, I mean the old growth trees do, but then they will also cease at some time. Not just like when we grow old and have gray hair, we stop growing, our biomass stops, and so on. So. Yeah.
So two sort of unrelated questions. The first is, I think a lot of your research techniques would have also improved with time. There will be access to much better satellite imagery, probably drone imagery, and so on. So can you just shine a light on how you're innovating on that front also?
Yeah. What we are innovating is, I'll just be again very brief. In fact, there's a lot of discussion today about the whole global carbon budget. I'll again put it in a nutshell. There are people like us, largely, working on the field, going and taking measurements of trees, seeing what's happening to carbon stocks. Other people are looking at it totally from space, measuring NDVI, chlorophyll content, and then seeing what's happening. Then there are people who use CO2 flux towers. There is a technique called eddy covariance, and a lot of flux towers are being put up. And now you need to have a match between all of these three. Now, definitely there is a role for satellite image, in estimating, but you need to then corroborate whatever measurements that you're taking from your satellites, your spectral signatures, with what is actually happening on the ground. That integration of that research has to happen. It is, unfortunately, by and large, globally, this is not only in India, largely the two communities are separate. But another 2 months I'll be attending a meeting where we are trying about how to see how you can bring these different communities together so that you have one integrated picture.
Sir, here.
Sir, and my second question.
There's somebody else who had a question. Yeah, please.
Could you just ask the question after him, or one question's here, and then you can ask.
Sir, here. This side, sir. So, sir, I could see from the data that carbon sequestration or sinking of carbon, I found that in your data point it was going down and again came back. That's made you interpret that it's becoming cyclical, kind of. Yeah, could be. But what are the factors which makes it come back? Like it was going down, but it's now again coming back and the ability is coming back.
Right. No, I think it's essentially right now from what we have been able to pick up, the signals are essentially fire and rainfall. Temperature, we expect it to have an impact, but temperature effects for us to pick up at that kind of a scale is very difficult. But I think now with the 30 years of data and temperatures having gone up, we'll be testing for those. But essentially rainfall and
that is kind of the one step further for that is, what make us conclude that in Amazon that's not the same thing that is happening? Its carbon sinking ability is going down, and what makes us sure that it will not come back again?
It could, I don't know. Because what's happening, the global models, global vegetation models are now actually predicting something quite dire for the Amazon.
Okay.
They're talking about tipping points. You know, these alternative stable states, they're all mathematical concepts. In the past, Amazon has actually been a savanna in the past. You go back into the Pleistocene glaciation history and so on. So there is a fear that it might flip into that state, that from a wet forest it could become a dry forest, in which case a lot. But you know, but then climate change, temperature increase, no? See, the temperatures are going up. At those very high temperatures, you cannot sustain a positive balance of photosynthesis and respiration. Plant respiration will start increasing. So a whole lot of other problems are there. Then nutrient limitation is there. So it's a yeah. I think Dr. Rajeevan had a question now.
I think we can take one last question.
I think there's a question here. Yeah, here.
One last question, please.
Yeah, sir. Thanks for your insightful lecture, sir. The recent study what we conducted, that is integrated with satellite remote sensing as well as the ground-based studies for the carbon stock and as well as the biodiversity. So I'll talk on this, I'll say a few words on the carbon stock.
Could you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, myself, Dr. Wazid Pasha. I'm working with Professor Vinay Kumar.
So that everybody knows who you are. Right.
So the relation between the forest age and as well as the carbon stock, they have the strong relation. So that we established it in the Tripura, and it found that 2.8 teragram carbon with age integration with the field and as well as the satellite data. Or without age, you are getting 11 teragrams. So this is the carbon uncertainty for a Tripura state. So likewise, if you see the country, so we will get to much more.
Yeah, certainly. You know,
so
FSI, Forest Survey of India, they have got a lot of data.
Yes, sir.
But they are not out in the public domain for other scientists to use.
Yes,
so on, so.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
I now request the Vice Chancellor to present a token of our gratitude to Professor Sukumar for having taken time to be here and explain it in quite a lot of detail for us at least.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a short 10-minute break and reconvene for the next speaker's talk.